How can investors be better owners of their companies? Well, one man who's given that question a lot of thought is James Gifford. He's the Executive Director of the United Nations-backed Principles for Responsible Investment. You probably haven't heard of them, but if you're an investor in funds in the UK, then your investment manager is probably one of its signatories. He's also a contributor to the Q Finance Encyclopedia of all things financial. He joins me now. James, let's start with the charge that investors have historically been quite poor at executing their roles as company owners. I'm thinking perhaps of the run-up to the banking crisis, where bank shareholders approved remuneration structures that later proved to be highly counterproductive. Is that fair?
I mean, this is a very long history. In the 1930s, corporations were owned by wealthy individuals and the corporations were accountable to those individuals. Since the Second World War, and really for the last 50 years, we've seen the ownership of large corporations diffused and diversified right throughout the world, where most investors, even large investors, only own a tiny portion of the company. So what we have is a kind of a managerial capitalism rather than an ownership capitalism. And I think the corporate governance movement and the Principles for Responsible Investment are trying to bring back responsibility for monitoring management to the genuine owners of companies, which through pension funds and various other mutual funds and unit trusts are actually mostly the ordinary shareholders and ordinary workers.
And so what progress still needs to happen? How can investors get better at influencing company behaviour?
If you're an individual investor who wanted to know, how can I make sure that my money is being managed by a manager who has these issues under control, the first thing is to ask about dedicated staff. This is very time consuming. Organisations need dedicated staff, or they need to outsource to other service providers who do have dedicated staff to implement responsible investment. In practical terms, there are two key elements that are required to be a responsible investment. The first is to integrate a full range of environmental, social, corporate governance risks into investment analysis. So that's due diligence. And I think that was one of the things that was really missing in the financial crisis, is a lot of organisations simply didn't know what was in their portfolios. They weren't looking carefully enough and deeply enough. The second element of being a responsible investor is active ownership, which is making sure that you have the capability to engage in dialogue with the companies or investment entities in which you invest, and you can vote your shares in an informed way at annual general meetings. Now, it's important to recognise that most individuals need to rely on institutions to do this.
There have been those high-profile cases like Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall versus Tesco on the issue of chicken welfare, hugely well publicised and yet failed to make an impact.
A company will only change if it sees a really good reason to change. Now, that reason could be a reputational reason, and the Tesco issue with the chicken welfare had reputational impacts. And I would suggest that while that particular campaign may not have been successful in the short term, it raised awareness of an issue and over the longer term will probably contribute to the debate. However, in other cases where investors have taken issues of child labour in the Uzbek cotton production supply chain, Tesco has responded. And I also think that it's important to focus on the legitimacy of the organisation actually asking something of the company. If it's a mainstream investor who has a genuine concern about a long-term risk that the company is facing because of an environmental or ethical or social corporate governance issue, and the investor has done their homework and convinced the company that actually you need to do something about this, then the company is more likely to do something about it. If the company sees it as a single issue campaign organisation, they're not going to be as amenable to that type of campaigning.
Now, it's been suggested that even in those cases where shareholders and companies are in agreement, There's always those armies of lawyers and financiers and advisors who have different interests at heart, and perhaps the example of Cadbury would be a good one, where it is certainly in the interests of the advisors for that acquisition to take place. And so it's been suggested that the shareholder model of capitalism might just not work because it's so hard for shareholders to actually promote their own long-term interests.
If shareholders don't have the intermediaries in place to represent them and ensure that companies are acting in their best interests, then the system is broken. Corporations that don't feel any sense of accountability from their shareholders end up imposing huge agency costs on those shareholders, and to be frank, management runs amok. I think we've seen that in dozens of examples, from Enron, right through to recent times. If we can aggregate the interests of 10, 20, 30 or more % of the shareholders of companies, then I think we can fix the system. And that's one of the reasons the PRI developed our engagement clearinghouse. It's a place for all of these diffuse investors to come together, come up with common positions on how to keep the companies accountable.
And how are you funded? Does your funding come from your signatories, or is it from the United Nations itself?
We're funded almost exclusively by signatories to the principles. It's a voluntary contribution at this stage. In 2011, it will become a mandatory contribution to be a signatory.
And so those bodies that are putting money towards a PRI, are they themselves getting a good return on investment, so to speak? What concrete examples of success can the PRI show?
Obviously, the PRI, as a set of high-level principles, can be implemented in many, many ways, and it would be far too simplistic to say that being a good active owner will automatically mean you outperform your peers. Everyone's trying to outperform the average. So what we argue, though, is over the long term, if you are a responsible investor in the sense that you take into account a full range of long-term risks and opportunities in your investment analysis and due diligence, and you combine that with an active ownership approach where you engage in dialogue with companies and other investment entities and ensure they act in your best interests, then you should perform well. You should, those investments should be better than if you ignore these long-term risk and opportunity issues and you don't try to hold management to account. Can you prove that? No, but you can't prove that any investment strategy will outperform. It's a very strong and plausible argument that the more you know about a company, the better investor you'll be.